Session. I want you to turn in your Bibles to Luke 15, Luke chapter 15. And I don't know what your background is as far as church is concerned, but I grew up in church. I don't have a memory that exists outside of church, to be honest with you. I went to grandma's house first and church next. And, I don't really have much memories outside of church. That was just my parents were believers, and I was raised in a church atmosphere. And so, therefore, my earliest memories are children's stories, right? All the stories that you get in Sunday school and in children's church. And, we got Jonah and the whale and David and Goliath, and we got Daniel and the lion's den. And we had so many stories that I grew up knowing and hearing. And one of the ones we're going to talk about today is one of those stories that as a child, I grew up hearing about this story. And I've heard messages on this story. And I've heard people talk about this story in Luke 15. And it's a parable that Jesus is telling. But several months ago, I am reading through Luke, and I'm struck with this parable. And I'm struck with it because I saw something different that I hadn't seen before. And I called my brother, because my brother also is a student of the Word, and he also teaches the Word. And I called my brother, and I said, "You're not going to believe this, but I just saw this parable in Luke 15 of the prodigal son in a completely different way than I've ever seen it before." And he goes, "You're late to the show." I said, "What do you mean I'm late to the show?" He said, "I've been in Luke 15 for 4 months." And I'm like, "What?" He goes, "I know what you're going to say already." He said, "God brought me there 4 months ago." And I'm like, and I'm getting ready to tell him, and I'm like, and he's like, "I know. It's good, isn't it?" And I was like, "That's so awesome." And I'm like, "Well, you needed that, so I'm glad God showed you that, because you needed that." Yeah. Younger brothers, right? You got to give them a hard time. So it's like I was preparing and putting these things together. God kept drawing me back to this. And he kept drawing me back to this. And my 72 times in the car with good Father kept drawing me back to this. And every time I tried to go somewhere else, the Lord would say, "Luke 15, Luke 15. And I was like, "Lord, I know. I'm not ready for it because, Lord, there's just so much in there. I need more time to study Luke 15. And I'm going to put it all together in a real pretty package. I'm going to put a bow on it, and I am going to share it." And the Lord said, "No, you're not putting a bow on it. And you're not putting it in a pretty package. Just get up there and do what I tell you to do." So here we are. Luke 15. And I want us to understand the context of this. And honestly, I can't even begin to tell you all of the things that are going on in Luke 15. I just pray that God will give us just a flavor of it, just a taste of it today, that when you leave, you're going to want to go home and spend the next couple months in Luke 15. That's what I'm hoping. If you read Luke 15 for 1 month solid every single day, you got up every day and read Luke 15, I'm just going to tell you, God will teach you something new about who he is every single day in Luke 15. But let's set the context, because guess what? Most of us did not grow up in the Middle East. We have absolutely no idea the cultural importance of this story. We do not understand the culture of the Middle East a lot of times. We do not understand the traditions that were held by the Jewish people and the people that lived at the time of Christ in this locale. There's a lot of things, and not understanding that is the reason that I always thought the story was about the boy. I always thought the story was about that lost son and getting that lost son right with God. And then every time I heard it told, it's called the prodigal son. But I don't know that I'll ever look at Luke 15 again without calling it the good Father. Yes. The good Father. And so, pack this just a little bit. Let me tell you what's happening prior to Luke 15, okay? Luke is one of the Gospels that was written in chronological order. It's one of the only Gospels that's written in chronological order, so Luke tells it as it chronologically happens. And that really helps us. But Jesus is in the last months of his life, and he's on his way to Jerusalem to die on a cross. Okay? We understand that. Jesus' audience that he is telling this parable to, and a parable is a story that Jesus made up, that he created with a point. Okay? It's a parable. A parable is a story that has a point. There's something we're supposed to get out of it. And Jesus' audience are Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and honestly, if we want to put them in their one title, it would be his enemies. These are the people who Jesus is speaking to in Luke 15. And the deal is, this is what's been happening prior to Luke 15. The Pharisees are doing their very best to discredit Jesus. They're doing their very best to say, you are not the Messiah. And they have to have some way to prove it, because he's doing a lot of miracles. People are following him. People are flocking to him. So how do we discredit him? And the Pharisees came up with the perfect plan to discredit him. And this was their big thing. You cannot be Messiah because you eat with publicans and sinners. You hang out with dirty people. You hang out with lost people. You hang out with people who are tax collectors. Oh, and that was like a curse word in the Jewish culture, because these were their own people who were taking taxes for them from Rome. You hang out with sinners. Jesus, goodness gracious, he hangs out with prostitutes. Goodness gracious, you cannot be Messiah. So, since you cannot be Messiah because you hang out with all these bad people, your power's got to come from somewhere, so it comes from the devil. So that's who you are. You are of the devil. And this was their favorite argument. This was it. And they would come to Jesus, and they would bring it out, who you hang out with, and who you spend time with. And so when we get to Luke 15, if you look at verse 1, it says, then drew near unto him all the publicans and the sinners. Here they all are. Here's all these sinners coming to Jesus. And they're drawing near to him. And this is the perfect moment for the Pharisees to step in and say, see? Sinner, sinner, sinner. Because see, and you got to understand, the Pharisees were very pious. They had their act together. They were dressed impeccably. And they would never touch anything unclean. They would never look at anything unclean. In fact, they would let a man die on the side of the road and step by him before they would get their hands contaminated with the unclean. They upheld the law. They were holy. They were what pleased God. But what Jesus told us about the Pharisees is, and what he told them in some serious, scathing remarks, is, yeah, you look real good on the outside, but on the inside, you're dead. You're like a tomb. It's all like pretty and white on the outside and got flowers on the front. Open it up and it's got dead people in it. That's who you are. And so they were one thing on the outside, and they were another thing on the inside. And so when Jesus is speaking, look at verse 2. And the Pharisees and the scribes murmured. Can you see them? All the publicans and all the sinners are gathered around Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes are over here going, no, I can't believe he's letting these people. These are unclean people. Please don't let anybody touch me. Okay, we've got to make sure we don't get near these people. Okay, you with me? It's bad news. And the Bible says in verse 3 that Jesus spake this parable unto them. Now, Jesus is going to tell 3 stories, and they're going to come sequentially. The first story that he is going to tell is going to be about a man who had 100 sheep, and he lost one. And he leaves the 99 sheep in the pen, and he goes out and he searches until he finds that one sheep that was lost, and he rejoices. The next story he tells is about a woman who lost a coin. And out of all the coins that she had, she lost one. And that she cleaned and she cleaned and she cleaned and she cleaned and she cleaned. And she finally found that coin. And she called all her friends and she rejoiced because she found the coin. And what Jesus is trying to get them to understand is that he came to seek and to save that which was lost. That's why he came. He came to seek and to save the lost. And so the Pharisees needed to get lost in a spiritual sense. They needed to get lost. They didn't think they needed him. They had their act together. And Jesus is like, no, you don't. The people who are listening to me are the people that I came to seek and to save. And heaven rejoices when one of them repents. When one. And that's why it's so important that we never play down one life that's been touched. Honestly, if there was one woman that left this building today with her life forever changed, it would be worth everything we've done this weekend. Everything. If one woman was sitting here and did not know Jesus Christ as personal Savior and she accepted Christ, it would be worth everything that we have done. Everything we have done. And so Jesus says it's about the one. It's about these sinners. That's why I came. That is why I came. But Jesus saves the biggest story with the biggest punch and the biggest to draw them in to last. So we got the lost sheep, we have the lost coin, and now we have the lost son. And I cannot begin to tell you how Jesus sets this story up for them. But Jesus was a master storyteller. And so when he told this story, I need you to see the crowd. Okay? You got publicans and sinners. You have Pharisees. But both groups live in the same town and know the same culture and have the same upbringing and understand what is this is the way we do it around here. Come on, this is the South. We got that same kind of structure, do we not? This is just kind of how we do it around here. They had that same thing. So Jesus begins to tell a story, and immediately all of these people are drawn into the story. I can imagine you could hear a pin drop as Jesus begins to tell this third and last story of this son, because this would have just drawn everybody in and connected everybody in a way that would have been they were hooked. Okay, and let me explain to you why. First of all, Jesus starts off, and in verse 11, he says, after he's told the story of the coin and the sheep, he says in verse 10, likewise I say unto you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repents. And now he draws the story in. A certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. Now this verse is so insignificant. I'm telling you, when we tell his story, we're like, okay, this kid, he wanted his stuff. No, you got to understand this thing. Okay? In Middle Eastern culture and in Asian culture in general, the concept of honor and shame are huge. Okay? There is a huge concept of honor, and there is a huge concept of shame. And these two concepts were huge then, and believe it or not, if you'll travel today, they're huge today. Shame and honor. So everyone sitting there understood when this son came to his father, number one, he's the youngest son. Now, according to the rules, the youngest son only gets 1/3 of the father's inheritance. The oldest son gets 2/3. Because he's the oldest son. It's the way they did it. There's nothing about dividing anything evenly. You're the oldest, you get most. And because I'm the oldest, I feel that we should continue that tradition. So, The oldest gets the most. The youngest gets the least amount. So here's the youngest son coming up to the father before the father's dead. When do you hand out the inheritance? When the father's dying, drawing his last breath, or dead? The youngest son comes to the father and says, I want my inheritance right now. This was shameful. It was disrespectful to the father. It was a slap in the father's face. Because basically what this son was doing was saying, I wish you were dead and I could have my stuff. And to me, you are dead. I don't care about a relationship with you. I don't want to stay here any longer. I've had enough of this place. I want my inheritance. I'm leaving. There was no gratitude for anything the father had done for him. None. No love for the father. This is what should have happened in this culture. Everyone listening to the story, remember? Sinners, Pharisees. They all knew what was going to happen next. Because in that culture, when a son disrespected his father in any way, there was an immediate response, and it was a slap to the face from father to son. The father would lift his hand and slap his son across the face to shame his son for the dishonor he had shown to the father. It was culturally, that was what would have happened. So, they're all ready for Jesus to say, and the father slapped the son across the face. There was something else would have happened. The father would have kicked the boy out for a time period, or for good. You've shamed us. You've disgraced our family. You are no longer welcome here. And he would, in many cases, in fact, some of the commentaries that I read about how the cultural times were, they would literally, when a father was disgraced, sometimes they would kick a son out and have a funeral for him. And he wasn't even dead. But to the family, you are dead to me. Kind of like Mafia Godfather kind of thing. You're dead to me. Right? No. As far as I'm concerned, you wish I wasn't alive so you could have your stuff? Well, guess what? I'm still the father. And you're not getting anything. Leave. And he would have been shamed. He would have been disgraced. It's another thing that the son wasn't asking for. In fact, if you look the Greek word up, and this is where it caught my eye. This is the first thing that I train wrecked into. When I looked up the word for what the son was asking for, he's not asking for leadership, responsibility, or part of the estate to manage and run. He's asking for cash. He doesn't want what his family's built. He wants cash. He wants to leave. And we see this is exactly what he did. And in this culture, this was suicide for this son. I mean, everybody listening to Jesus would have went, oh, well, we know what's going to happen to him. He's out. He's out. But if you know the story, it's not what happened at all. The verse I just read says, and the father did what? The father gave him his inheritance. Now we got another problem. The audience listening to Jesus would have been like, he did what? And this is what you got to understand. The Pharisees would have said, that is a disgrace. That is shameful that a father would do that. He's disgraced himself. How can you let a kid like that dishonor you like that? You cannot let that happen. That son deserves to be kicked out. He deserves to be slapped across the face. He deserves to be dead to that father. That's what he deserves. I can't believe the father would do something like this. We're just ashamed of this father. But the story tells us that the father divided the inheritance. And notice it's interesting, but he says that when he divided the inheritance among not just the boy, but he actually divided the inheritance between them both. So here we have it. And the rest of the story tells us that the boy takes off, as we thought he might. In verse 12, we see him asking for it. We see the father dividing it unto them, these two sons. He divides it unto them. And look at verse 13, and not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and he took his journey into a far country. Now, again, far country, this is not the town next door. If he lived in New York, this would be California. Okay? He's like, I'm leaving you guys. I'm gone. I am out of here. The word that's used for far country is a far distance away. He's out. So he takes what he's got, he leaves, and the Bible says, and there he wasted his substance with riotous living. When he gets to the far country with cash and with stuff, everybody's like, woo, here comes the party boy, and he's got money. And suddenly now everybody wants to hang out with a guy who's buying everything, right? And the Bible says he wasted it all. Now again, Jesus, got to see the audience. Probably the publicans and sinners are like, yeah, we get that. Been there, done that. But the Pharisees are like, we told you. We told you. What a waste. How shameful. How disgraceful. That's terrible. Even the publicans knew this was bad. This is bad. But as we get down to verse 14, the Bible tells us that a severe famine hits the land. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. I'll tell you, and this is not really the heart of the story, but I'm going to tell you, God lets us go and he lets us do our stuff, but I'm going to tell you that we hit rock bottom. We can hit rock bottom, and this guy hit rock bottom. Yeah, his daddy had given him what he wanted, and he had walked away. But he hits rock bottom. He spent all he's got, and now a famine hits, and he's starving to death. Verse 15, and he went and he joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him unto his fields to feed the swine. Now again, if you don't take culture and religious distinction into consideration when you just read this verse, you're like, okay, bless his heart, he had to go feed pigs. Girls, this is a Jewish boy. A Jewish boy pig is an unclean animal. So he would have been raised all his life to not mess with the pigs because they're unclean. You don't eat pigs, they're unclean. So when Jesus picks not a cow, not a goat, and not a sheep, but a pig, oh, he has just doubled it up on the Pharisees. I mean, the Pharisees are like, oh, pig! Oh, this is horrible. Now he's with pigs. And he says that he attached himself to a citizen of that country. Citizen, that word citizen would give us the idea that this man was a nobleman. He was an actual, he had some clout, so he probably had some money. And so he's probably got a state of some sort. And so he's got pigs. And so this prodigal, this son goes and says, look, I'll be a hired day worker. The idea of this verse, that he attached himself to it, if you read it and you break it down a little bit, it's the idea that he asked the guy, would you hire me to be a day worker? I'm gonna pay, you just pay me one day at a time. And apparently the guy didn't have much to be able to pay him because of the famine. And so look what it says. He says, 16, he would have fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. He's feeding these pigs, supposed to be taking care of these pigs, and you know what he's doing? He's so hungry because nobody's helping him at all, that he's eating the husk that the pigs don't eat. Now, if you've ever been in close personal relationship with a pig, you understand that there's not a whole lot they don't eat. They eat just about anything. But according to my understanding, this husk, the pigs couldn't digest it well, so they would eat everything out of it. They would snout their nose in it until they got everything out of it, and then they would leave that part. If you've ever been around a pig, you know that the snout thing is awfully messy. So here's a pig, been snouting around in husk, tossed it, and here's the son picking it up and trying to pull out of it what he can to eat nourishment. And I know those of you who have a weak stomach are like, can we stop this part of the story right now? But this was desperate times. This is where this boy's at. And so the next part, and you know what? Pharisees are going, well, that's exactly what he deserves. Shamed his father like that, acted like an idiot. That's exactly what he deserves. But a pig, whew, that Jewish boy will never be accepted anywhere ever again because he spent time with pigs. So all of a sudden now, Jesus is telling this story. Can you just see everybody sitting there is going, okay, what's next? Because Jesus has got their attention. Some of them are already incensed and outraged. Some of them think they know how the story is going to end. And so this is verse 17. And when he came to himself. And when he came to himself. It's like all of a sudden, it dawns on him. And he has this aha moment. And this is what comes to him. My Father at home hires day laborers. And I've never seen one of them have to eat the pig slop. My Father cares for his day laborers better than what I have. When he came to himself, do you know the first thought that entered his mind? His dad. His dad. My Father has hired servants, these day laborers, and they have bread enough to spare, and yet I perish with hunger. Verse 18 is huge. Because in the first two parables, the coin and the sheep, Jesus has only talked about the idea of how heaven rejoices when the lost are found. But in this third parable, Jesus explains how lost become found. And this is something in our world that we've gotten away from. And it is true, you can come to Jesus any way you are. But there is a point that all of us, no matter who we are and where we are, we have to come to ourselves. And the next words he uttered have to be uttered by us at some point in time in our lives, because the boy now is going to he's lost his pride now. He's humbled now, and listen to what he says. I will arise and go to my father. And I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. The boy says, I'm getting up and I'm going to go to Dad. And I know what I'm going to say. When I get there, I know what's going to happen. And he did according to culture. And let me explain to you, I'm going to pause here and I'm going to tell you, according to culture, what's going to happen to this boy. And everyone listening to the story knows what's going to happen to this boy when he arises and he goes back to the father. Everybody knows what's getting ready to happen. This boy is planning his approach to the father. And he says, I'm going to rise and I'm going to go tell my father I've sinned. I sinned against God and I've sinned against you. And he said, this is what I'm going to tell him. I'm no more worthy to be called your son. Because culture would not allow this boy to be called a son again. Because he had disgraced the father too much. So here's what the boy knew to expect. The boy was going to come back into the town. And when he entered the town and people saw him, they were going to start going, disgrace, shame, shame, shame on you. How dare you come back here? Shame, shame. And everywhere he went, they would have screamed shame at him. Then when he got to the father's house, the father would say, I'm sorry, but I cannot see you at this time. Come back in a week. Cold shoulder. The boy would be left to sit outside the gate of the father's house. Now, this is all culture. This is all understanding how the culture worked at the time and what was required of them. He would have sat outside the gate, and people would have walked by. Shame. I hope he doesn't take you back. You're a disgrace. You're an embarrassment. Shame. And after a while, sitting out in front of the gate and taking it all, the father would send for him. One of the historical documents I read said that the boy would be required to bow on his face and kiss his father's feet. And he would be required then to say, Father, I'll work as a day laborer for you. And his dad would give him his sentence, his punishment. This is what you will do. This is how you will do it. This is when you will do it. And maybe and possibly I will consider bringing you in as a slave. Now, a day worker and a slave were different. A day worker was someone who the father did not take any care of at all. He just came in, worked, got his wages, and left. But a slave would have been somebody that was higher than a day worker. They would have been a person that the father would have provided care for, rooms for, lodging for. He would have provided for their family. He would have provided all their meals. He would have provided all their clothing. He would have provided them with a job. And everything they did, the father would have taken care of them completely because they worked for him full time. So the boy said, I know this is, he knows what's going to happen. And so he's preparing his speech. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So if you could just make me one of the hired servants, a day laborer. And so this is what he's hoping for. And so he rehearses this. And he understands that he's going to have to bear the shame. And he's going to have to bear the guilt. And he understands that people are going to scream at him. And he understands that town is going to turn on him. And he understands that his own family and his own father is going to treat him coldly. But honestly, he understands, I've sinned, and really, this is what I deserve. I disgraced my father. And then he gave me the stuff, and I don't have a thing to show for it. I don't have a penny in my pocket. I smell like a pig. I'm starving to death. I'm filthy. I have on no shoes and I have on no robe, as we're going to see in just a few minutes. So a filthy boy heads home with no shoes, looking like a vagrant probably. And the Pharisees are probably standing there going, he's doing well. He needs to come home. But we all need to shame him. I hope everybody spits upon him. Yep. He's doing the right. Justice will be served. And he will teach a lesson to all the other young little boys who live in the village that they better not act like this. And this is where the story turns you on your head. And this is where it turned the audience on their head. Because the next verses, when you know what was supposed to happen, what would have happened in that culture, and what would have happened according to the way the Jews conducted their honor system and their system of shame, and the way the Middle East would have conducted that, and the culture of the village, when you understood all of these components, and you know what's supposed to happen, and you know what the boy's expecting to happen, then what happens next is mind-boggling. Because the Bible tells us, and he arose in verse 20, and he came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off. Now we got to stop. Great way off is not to the back door. A great way off is the boy was way on down the road. You with me? And I don't know where this father was at. It would make sense that he may have been in the village, in the area. I don't know. Maybe he was at his property. I don't know where the father was at. But this is what we do know. That when the boy was a long ways off, the father saw him coming. The father saw him coming. There's only one way the father could see him coming a long ways off, and that's if the father was looking for him. It's the only way he could see him coming. It'd been the only way. The dad was looking for the son. I don't know. Maybe it was every day. I don't know what his routine was. The Bible doesn't tell us, but all we know is this father was looking for this boy. And see, when we understand the parable, what we know is Jesus is representing this in the story. The Father is God. The younger son is every publican and sinner sitting in that audience. And the older son is every Pharisee sitting in that audience. And so when we understand that Jesus is telling this story to help them understand who they are and who they are in relationship to who He is, and they're trying to paint a picture, Jesus is giving them a completely radical picture of who God is. He is not the person they thought He was. He's the good Father. He's the Father who, a long way off, could that be Him? Wow, he kind of walks like Him. He kind of's got that bounce. But man, it's not much of a bounce anymore. I don't know. He doesn't. Could that be Him? Now, if you're a Pharisee, you're already going, this is just a disgrace. This is an absolute disgrace. Why is the father looking for the boy? The father needs to go back and refuse to see the boy. This is what should happen. Hurry up, father. Run. Get back to your home. Actually, they wouldn't have said run, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. But what Jesus says next, I got a feeling the Pharisees, somebody probably had to catch a Pharisee or two as they passed out. Because the Bible tells us, as Jesus tells the story next, He says, when he was a great way off, his father saw him and he had compassion. That means his heart welled up with love for the object he was seeing. And he ran. Now, girls, he ran, so what? And when I got to studying, this is the part where, man, I was blown away. Because I've seen my father run. He plays sports. When I was younger, I've seen him run up and down basketball courts. I've seen him run with me in the yard. I've seen him run behind my bicycle when he's trying to teach me how to ride a bicycle with no training wheels. I've seen my father run because in America, we see men run all the time, and there's nothing about that. But in the Middle East, and it's still true today, and I called a friend of mine, and I said, I need you to tell me if this is true or not, because I've read this in 2 accounts, and I need to know if this is really true, because I can't tell people this is true if it's not true. And they live in the Middle East. And I said, is it a shame for a Middle Eastern man to run? And my friend said, oh, absolutely. A Middle Eastern man does not run. And I'm like, okay, explain this to me. Here's the deal. A nobleman who lived in that part of the world would wear a long robe. He would be dignified. And he would never run. Because running was below his dignity. He had people to run for him. People ran for him. He did not run. The other problem with running is that in order for a nobleman to run, he would have to hike up his robe and he would have to show his legs. And because we live in a culture where we've been looking at guys' legs for a really long time now. It's not a shame or a disgrace in America to see a guy in shorts. But in this part of the world, it was shameful for anyone to see a man's legs. That was a nobleman. That was something slaves did. And so a nobleman wore extra long robes. And there's even a story about in their culture that they gave them like rules that says, if a bird flies up in your robe, seriously, this is true. I read this. They had rules for this. If a bird flies up in your robe, you cannot raise your robe to remove it. And so they had a whole thing that the nobleman could do to get rid of his bird that flew up in his robe. This was hysterical. These are the things I read. Go by the book table. This is good. So a Middle Eastern man, he would have never pulled his robes up as a nobleman, and it was a disgrace to show his legs, and it would have been a shame for him to run. This is where God just flipped me over. Here we got a son who's coming down the road, ready to be shamed and disgraced. Are you ready? He knows it. He knows the minute he hits town, he's going to hear it. Shame! Disgrace! Puh! And people would spit on him. And you know that every step he takes is a long one. Man. But somewhere there's a father who sees him afar off. And that daddy knows as good as that boy knows. When that boy, if that boy is coming through town, I don't know if he's coming through town or not, but if he's coming through town, he's going to be shamed. He's going to be disgraced. He's going to be screamed at. He's going to be laughed at. He's going to be mocked at. The daddy knows what the boy is getting ready to be experiencing and what people will expect. And the father pulls his robes up and he runs to the boy. And instead of the boy taking the shame, if daddy was running through town, the dad just took the shame. And so instead of everybody going, shameful boy, everybody in the town was going, what is wrong with him? That's a disgrace. Drop your robe. You're a nobleman. It's a shame. You're disgracing yourself. You're dishonoring yourself. You're disrespecting yourself. How dare you act that way? Stop it. But the good father doesn't care. He hikes it up and he sprints to the boy. And the Bible says when he finds the boy, he wraps his arms around the boy and he kisses him. And the word I use for kisses, he just kisses him all over. It's just, mwah, mwah, mwah. He kisses his head. Pig boy. Stinky boy. Boy has been eating unclean stuff. Father kisses him. And he hugs him. And he loves on him. Can you imagine the thoughts and the heart of the son? Who is bracing himself to be ridiculed by his whole town. Who's bracing himself to have to just get on his face and crawl to the Father. Who's bracing himself for the rejection he knows he's going to experience and he knows he's going to have to face, but he's going to endure it because it's all his stinking fault he did it. He's done it to himself. He's going to get through it. He's going to make it. It's going to be okay. And he's bracing himself. And all of a sudden he looks and a man he recognizes has his robes hiked up, running as hard as this guy can run towards the boy. And the boy can't even speak when his arms are wrapped around him and he's kissing him all over. Wow. It's a mind, I can only see the people's faces. The father's shamed himself. He's dishonored himself. That's horrible. That's horrible. How would he do that? Oh, my word. This is big. Because when the father takes the disgrace of the son, he shows grace to the son. And when we read what happens next, you're going to see that the son, you remember the son's rehearsed speech? I'm going to go to my father and I'm going to say, I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be your son, and would you just make me a day laborer, and I'll just work for you if you'll allow me to. I know I can't be your son anymore, but I'll just be a day laborer. You remember that part of it? Well, I want you to look at verse 21, because now the son has now had his first chance to speak. And the son probably pulls away a little from the father, and he looks at him, and maybe he's just speaking this in his ear. And he says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. He left out a part. Notice that? He left out the part of I'll be your day laborer. Why did he leave that out? I believe he left it out because there's no point in saying it, because he might not be worthy to be a son anymore. But the fact that his father ran down a road and rubbed his arms around him and is kissing him all over lets him know he is a son. He may not be worthy to be a son anymore, but he is a son. Because daddy is like, my boy. This is my boy. And he's come home. And he's wrapping his arms around him, and he's kissing him, and he's hugging him, and he's loving him. You know what the boy knows in his heart and in his mind? I'm not going to have to be a day laborer. I'm going to get to go home. I'm going to get to go home. I'm not going to have to sit outside that gate. I'm not going to have... All has been forgiven. I can't believe it. I know the boy has to be blown away. And look what the father says. The father doesn't even say, yes, you are exactly right, you were horrible. The father doesn't say, I cannot believe how you squandered all my money. The father doesn't say, you smell really bad. Let me show you what the father says. But the father said to his servants. So I don't know. If he's in town, can you only imagine? The nobleman takes off at a sprint, the servants are like, we have no idea where he's going, but we're going with him. I don't know. Maybe the servants are there at the estate. But he calls to his servants. He says, come here. And listen to what he says to do. Bring forth the best robe. And put it on him. And put a ring on his hand. And put shoes on his feet. Now I want to stop there for a second, because these are big deals. Okay? The best robe in the house belonged to the father. It would have been equivalent to our tuxedo in his day. It would have been a fancy robe. He would have only worn it for very special, dignified occasions like weddings, or, thought this was really interesting, the father oftentimes pulled out the best robe when he was handing over the authority of the property and the things to the eldest son. What the father did in the next few seconds of these steps is what he would have done had he been handing it over officially to the eldest son. He said, bring the best robe, and that would be my robe. Bring the family ring, that would be a signet ring, that would be the family seal or crest on the ring. Bring that ring, and that would be the father's ring, and I'm going to put that on the hand of the son, and that gives him authority to act in my stead anytime he needs to. And bring sandals for the boy's feet, because he's not a slave, he's a son. And sons wear sandals, and slaves go barefooted. So bring my boy a pair of shoes. And the servants take off, and they come back with the father's best robe. And they place it on Stinky Pig Boy. Now, I believe he got cleaned up. Father says, clean him up. I believe he got cleaned up, but they placed this robe on him. And Stinky Pig Boy, who's probably covered in dust, covered in filth, nasty and gross, is now clean. standing in the Father's best robe with sandals on his feet and the family ring on his finger, as if, not he's the youngest, but as if he's the oldest son, number one, and as if he had never violated and disrespected the Father. You're talking about a good father. I promise you, when he starts talking about robe and a ring and sandals, the Pharisees are probably spitting already. It's kind of a Middle Eastern thing to do. I don't get it, but they do that. It's disgrace, shameful. Father. What kind of fathers don't do that? Nobody does that. That's completely wrong. He's messing up the whole system. There's no grace because Pharisees didn't understand grace. But I'm going to tell you what a sinner does. Someone in need, someone who's made mistakes, someone who doesn't always get it right, somebody who's wasted their life and wasted the good gifts that have been given by the Father. Somebody like that, they sure appreciate grace. And you know, we started off and we talked about this all, this God of all. This God who spoke and it was. And we just drew a picture of God, how big you are, but just in bigness alone, it's not enough because God said, I'm not just big, I'm personal. I created an earth. And on that earth, I created trees and flowers and plants, and I created, and I knelt down in the dust, and I created man, and I breathed my very breath into him, and I walked with him, and I love him. And when he messed up in that garden, guess what I did? I already had a plan in place, and I sent my very own son to die for him because I love man. I love you. I love you. I want to be with you. I want you to be with me. I want you to have a great life. You don't understand. I have compassion for you. I'm crazy about you. That's the good Father. And I'll be honest with you, so many times that's not how we see God. We don't see him in his bigness, but we also don't see him in his personalness. We just, sometimes all we do is see him as big. Man upstairs. He's just some... And maybe some of you were raised in an environment where you were kind of taught that, you know, you kind of had to do everything just right, or God was going, and yes, God is a God of judgment. There's no question. You can't deny that he is a God of justice, but I'll be honest with you, God never has to lay down his love to be a God of justice. He can be a God of love and a God of justice all at the same time because that's who he is. It's incredible. And I just wonder, have you ever seen... See, Jesus says God is the Father. Have you ever saw him run to you? Do you understand when he, just a few months after he told this story, when he hung on Calvary, he took shame, he took our shame on him so we would not have to be shamed. The Bible says he bore our sin and our shame. Just like the Father took it from the Son. Jesus took it from us on Calvary. He bore it for us. Why? Because he's a good, good Father. That's who he is. And I'm loved by him. That's just who I am. And I didn't have to work to get it. I didn't have to earn it. I didn't have to do anything. He ran to me. He pursued me. He loves me. He came after me. He shamed himself for me. And I dishonored him and I disrespected him. And in my sin, I rejected him. And he says, Reba, I got compassion on you. I love you. And he ran. And he found me. And he took his robe of righteousness, the best robe. And he cleaned me up. And he put his robe on me. And he put the Holy Spirit in me as the source of family power, who is going to stay with me. And I can, through him, I've got the authority of the Father. And I got sandals on my feet. I'm a daughter. I'm a son. I'm no longer a slave. And so therefore, Paul says, since I am a child of God, how could I not but say, I am your slave? I'm not worthy to be called your child. I'll be called your doulos. I'll be called your slave. Because I'm not worthy to be your child. But we are. And I don't know where you stand. But I know there's people who are over here. Boy, should have got what he deserved. You want what you deserve? I want you to understand that when the story doesn't end, by the way. This story, if you look at it from a grammatical perspective, is told in perfect 8-stanza layout. Like a perfect story would be told. The first one, the second one. But guess what? In this one, it only uses 7. The last piece of the story is missing. And everyone in the audience listening to Jesus that day, it is the book that stopped with the cliffhanger. Because Jesus says, and we have the rest of the story as and our focus today is not the older brother, but I will just give you a blip of the older brother. The Bible says that the father says, kill the fatted calf. There's a calf. Every nobleman would have had a calf they had been saving up for celebration. And the father says, go get that one. Let's kill it. One of the commentators I read said it would feed 200 people, an average fatted calf. Guess what? The whole town's invited. Everybody comes. The father says, we are going to celebrate because my son who was dead is now alive. He was dead. He was gone. He didn't love me. He didn't want to be with me. He rejected me. He dishonored me. He was dead to me. But now he's alive. He's home. And we're going to celebrate. And the Bible tells us that the older son, coming in from the field, hears the music and the celebration, and he calls the servant over and he said, what's going on? Isn't it interesting that the father did not send for the older son? Isn't it interesting that the father did not call the older son to plan, because most of the historians I read said the older son would have been responsible for all family parties. The older son was not even notified. Now, since the older son is a picture of the Pharisees, we begin to understand that story. You see, the older son didn't love the father either. If he represents the Pharisees, guess what? He didn't love the father any more than the younger son did. He was just playing by the rules till it came his time. He didn't love the father. He didn't love his brother either. Because when the servant says, your brother is home, and he uses a very interesting thing. He says, your brother's home safe and sound. The literal translation of that is referred to the word shalom. It is, your brother is home and it is peace. Meaning, all is mended. He was letting the older brother know there will be no waiting period. He's not sitting outside the gate, and your dad is not mad. The calf has been killed. He's got a robe on. He's got a ring on. He's got the sandals on. And guess what? The whole town's rejoicing. And the next verse says, and the younger brother was so excited, and the older brother was so excited that his brother had come home. Oh no. The next verse says he was angry and he was mad, and he sent for the father. Now again, if you don't understand the culture, I'm just going to tell you what, the boy wouldn't even go into the party. He asked for the father to come out to him. That was shameful and disgraceful. You would never do that. He said, I'm not going in there. You know why? Because I'm not going to go in there and celebrate. He doesn't deserve any of this. I deserve this. He doesn't deserve this. I'm not going in there and celebrating anything with them. You send father to me. And then he rebukes his father. You've never done any of this for me. And I've been here. And you know, and the telltale story is the father says this to the son. You have been here, and I have been here all this time. And it's almost stated in such a way, when you read it in the original language, it's stated in a way as you could have had a relationship with me anytime you wanted to. Where have you been? You read it. It's like, you could have had a relationship with me anytime you wanted to. Where have you been? And I am celebrating the son with a restored relationship. And the brother is angry. And the father, in verse 32, ends the story. It was meet. It was imperative. This was the way it should be, that we should make merry and we should be glad. For this thy brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. And the story ends. But everyone in the audience is going, what happened to the son? What happened to the brother? What happened to the older brother? What happened to this? And Jesus leaves them completely hanging. He doesn't finish the story. And this is why I want to share this story with you, and why I believe God just put this on my heart, and He just would not let it out of my heart, and He just kept pounding it in my heart. I don't know if you've ever seen Jesus like a good father. Have you ever seen Him hiking up His robe and running down the road for you? Have you ever known how much compassion He has for you, how much love He has for you, how much joy He has for you, how much He wants to do you good? It's who He is. And you are loved by Him. I don't care how many pigs you've been hanging out with. And I don't care how deep you're in it right now. And you say, well, Reba, we're in church and this is a bunch of church people. We're not in it deep. Oh, really? I think church people are in it deeper sometimes than people who claim nothing about Christ, because we're deeply hidden. And because we're deeply hidden, we are not willing to suffer the shame and the disgrace that might come with being completely exposed. But we got to reach a point in our lives where we say, you know what? I'm not worthy to be called your daughter, but I've come and I'm sorry. And I've sinned. And I've never... And you may say, Reba, I'm not sitting here like the prodigal this morning. I'm not sitting here. I'm not doing that. I'm really trying to follow God. And I'm really trying to serve the Lord. And I want to ask us this morning, when is the last time that in our circumstances and in our situations and in our difficulties, we see Him as a God who runs, as a God who loves, as a God full of compassion for me and for you? When is the last time you saw Him like that? And you know, as we looked at Job, and how do you worship here? And I'll tell you how Job worshiped. Because he saw God as a good father. He saw Him as the awesome God that He is. And he knew and he could trust. And you know what? Jesus tells the story so everyone can know, I came not for the altogether, but I came for the people who needed me to put it all together. I came for the struggler. I came for the sinner. I came for the one in despair. I came for the one who is hopeless. I came for the one who doesn't have answers. That's who I came for. And I'm not sitting up in heaven with my arms crossed looking down at you going, why don't you get your act together? I'm hiking up my robes and I'm running to you because I love you. How shameful would it have been if that father had run to that son and the boy said, no, Dad, don't. Can't even imagine such a thing. And I just want you to know this afternoon that God, the same God of that prodigal and the same God of Job, is the God of us. He is that same good Father. And some of us are in desperate need to know Him as the good Father. And to know how much He loves us and how much He cares about us. And how much He wants to do a great thing in our hearts.